Welcome to the Vital Living Forum on elder abuse. Each year, hundreds of thousands of older adults are abused, neglected, or exploited. Unfortunately, authorities simply do not know for certain how many elders are suffering from abuse and neglect. Recent major studies have found that 7.6 to 10% of elders surveyed have experienced abuse in the prior year. Additional data from state adult protective services agencies across the U.S. show the incidence of elder abuse is increasing nationwide. In general, elder abuse refers to any knowing, intentional, or negligent act by a caregiver or any other person that causes harm or a serious risk of harm to a vulnerable adult. It is a crime, and all 50 states have passed some form of elder abuse prevention laws. Despite the accessibility of adult protective services in all 50 states, as well as mandatory reporting laws for elder abuse in most states, an overwhelming number of cases of abuse, neglect, and exploitation go undetected and untreated each year. In today's Vital Living Forum, we'll look at how elder abuse is defined and addressed according to Florida law, and then we'll walk through how elder abuse is reported and investigated. And in our final segment, we'll explore how families and communities can prevent elder abuse before it occurs. I'm Katie Dagenet, and let's get started. Ron Bledsoe is Program Administrator for the Adult Services Program in the District 7 office of the Florida Department of Children and Families. He has also served as an Adult Protective Investigator and Investigator Supervisor prior to his appointment as Administrator. Ron joined DCF's Adult Services Program in 1999, and during this tenure, he has directed thousands of elder abuse investigations. Ron received the Department Employee of the Year Award in 2006. His professional experience also includes over 23 years in law enforcement with the Anne Arundel County Police Department in Maryland. In 1984, Ron received the Police Department's Silver Star Award for Valor, and in 1995, he retired as a Patrol Division Lieutenant. Laura Moody is an Assistant State Attorney and Division Chief of the Elder and Economic Crimes Unit. Laura has worked for the Brevard State Attorney's Office as an attorney since 2007 and is a victim advocate from 2000 to 2004 before attending law school. As Division Chief of the Elder and Economic Crimes Unit, she is passionate about elder affairs and worked on the legislative task force that successfully passed improvements to the laws governing elder exploitation in 2014. Laura sits on the Brevard County Commission on Aging, the Senior Resource Alliance Advisory Board, is the treasurer for Brevard County's Triad, and hosts the Brevard Multidisciplinary Adult Protection Team meetings. Pedro Portuondo is the Adult Abuse Neglect Exploitation Coordinator for Senior Resources Alliance. Pedro covers 4 counties, providing professional and educational trainings to communities and agencies serving the aging population. The areas covered are Orange, Seminole, Brevard, and Osceola counties. Everyone, thank you so much for being here with us today. So Laura, let's go ahead and start with you. As a state prosecuting attorney, you've seen many cases come before the courts. Let's talk about a typical case. Can you tell us about one of them?
Absolutely. What we see primarily are exploitation cases. So I'll give you an example of the typical exploitation case we see. We have an elderly member living at home. Generally, these are cases we see happening in the home who will need some care in the home. So they will have either an adult family member, a caregiver, somebody who moves into the home with them. They will then start to assist them with finances, take over the check writing for the household, maybe using the ATM card to make purchases for the household, and through that they gain access to financial accounts. We then generally see that person take over as power of attorney many times. They will add themselves to bank accounts. We frequently then see nearly every asset converted into that caregiver, that family member's name. So we will see cars transferred into the perpetrator's name. We'll see houses being quitclaim deeded to that perpetrator. Then generally what happens is many months have passed. So we don't get these cases until something has really gone wrong terribly, where they can no longer pay their bills, or a bank notices that the spending is really out of control. We usually see these cases where there's some testing by the perpetrator. They see how much they can get away with. They learn that nobody is really watching. So we see those financial transactions tend to increase quite rapidly toward the end, till bills aren't being paid, and then notification would be made to DCF or law enforcement, and that's usually what triggers an investigation, is the depletion of funds, and that's when we generally get called in.
So Ron, what types of abuse will occur in this type of case?
In that particular case, what you have is exploitation, but as time goes along, you could also have neglect when the funds are gone and the person's not able to provide care to the individual, then you would probably have neglect also. And with the exploitation, under Florida law, exploitation is when a person obtains or uses a person's assets or property through deception or intimidation, and using those assets for someone other than the victim in the particular case. And with the neglect, what you have is where the caregiver, or the person living in the home acting as a caregiver, is unable to provide for the person's care and services in the home.
Let's talk about the law. Pedro, let's talk about Florida Statute 825.
825 talks about individuals from the age 18 and above, but for this particular case, we'll talk about seniors that's 60 and above, a senior who necessarily has aging and infirmities, that they're unable to take care of themselves in the sense that their inability due to some kind of organic brain disorder, mental or emotional disorder or dysfunction. So at that point, what happens is that that person needs some form of assistance.
Okay. So what else is included in terms of the law? What do people need to know in terms of what's not allowed under law? Because a lot of people might think that, well, if somebody else is using someone else's money and they've given verbal permission, that's okay.
I think the real key thing to know, and to add on to what Pedro said, is that I get a lot of questions about who is protected under Chapter 825 and exploitation. And the real key thing is that it's not just about age in Florida. The need for that assistance with activities of daily living is also critical. But what we also see, in addition to the deception and intimidation that Ron spoke about, is a separate section under the exploitation statute that deals with people who lack capacity to make those decisions. We see that quite frequently, where somebody will be taken into a bank. They may have been diagnosed with dementia. They may have Alzheimer's, or they have some memory loss, some sundowner's syndrome that's happening. And so the perpetrator is using that cognitive ability to gain access to the funds. So Florida law actually encompasses a variety of different behaviors. Breach of duties by a power of attorney would be a section we could prosecute under. The lacking capacity of person, and the person who is doing that, taking advantage, knows they lack capacity, as well as if they use deception or intimidation. So there's really three key areas that Florida law protects against.
Why is elder abuse so widespread, do you think, Pedro?
Well, what happens is at times that caregivers have seniors isolated from their families. They tend to pry on them. Repetition becomes reality at times, so the rapport building that they tend to do with the senior, they feel like that's the only person in their lives. With that being said and done, they open themselves up to that caregiver. So the caregiver at that point can take advantage of the situation.
How underreported is this? Because I think a lot of people who listening and watching today might think that, wow, is this really an issue? Is it underreported?
Absolutely. The statistics are, they report 1 in 44 cases are actually reported. So 43 cases that are not going reported. And what we generally see, and in that example I gave, is usually the perpetrator is the only support system for the elderly victim. So they really have nobody to turn to, and they may not know about the services that Pedro or Ron can provide. So that's the really key thing to know, is that we see it quite frequently, and we see it not reported because they don't know who to turn to or who to tell, and they have mobility issues, health issues. So that's one of the key reasons that it's so underreported.
And I imagine, and we've touched on this somewhat, that the consequences can be really atrocious, correct?
Correct.
Absolutely.
Correct. Sometimes individuals can lose their homes, their life savings. They also look at the depression kicks in. But when we look at a situation, if a senior loses their home, they can end up in a nursing home environment just because a caregiver has manipulated their funds through their diagnosis.
And let's go back to that, to the example that Laura gave, and speak to that. Where does this abuse usually occur?
Mostly at home. We'll say that there are seniors that are at home. They tend to need some limited assistance with ADLs, and there's a caregiver or there's a family member that tends to assist them with that. But it's important that a person who needs assistance just gets the assistance. It's not that someone comes in and ultimately takes over writing checks and doing transactions for the person, but intimidation sometimes kicks in, or the threats that they may end up in an assisted living or nursing home. So they tend to allow the caregiver to take over, per se.
And I would say, just to add to that, one of the number one things I hear when I have victims who are concerned about participating in the court process is that they believe if they report to authorities that the first thing that will happen to them is they will be removed from the home. They will be placed at a nursing facility, and it's very important for people to know that's not true. And that is why we do see most of our cases come out of private homes where a person is taken advantage of, because the offender uses that as the number one threat, that if you report this to law enforcement, if you report this to DCF, they'll take you and put you in a nursing home. So,
And that's one of the things that we see quite a bit is the victims in our case, they're so afraid that we're going to go in and remove them from the home and put them into an assisted living or skilled nursing facility. When we're there, we're concerned about their safety more than anything. And when we go into the home, that's our major concern right off the bat, is to make sure that they are safe and to make sure that somebody's not taking advantage of them or abusing or neglecting them in the home.
So that's speaking to the home. What about in the residential communities that you mentioned? You don't see as many there, but do you see them?
yes.
You do see them in residential community. However, they're monitored through the Agency for Healthcare Administration. You also have the Ombudsman's, that is an organization that go out and they advocate for seniors in the facilities. So with the monitoring systems in place, they happen less.
And I'll add to that, what we see primarily happen in the assisted living facilities or nursing homes will be small level takings, like there may be jewelry that goes missing by caregivers or family members. The thing we do see increase when somebody's living in an assisted living facility or nursing home is if somebody on the outside is taking care of their finances, they quit paying the bills there. We do frequently get calls called into DCF from nursing homes and skilled nursing facilities when their bills haven't been paid because the family member is using all of their funds for themselves. So.
Right.
So let's go back to the case. What makes people vulnerable to abuse? And I guess maybe an obvious one is we would think that it would be age, but there are many other factors, I would imagine.
Yes.
One of the main things, they have an impairment, either physically or mentally, which makes them vulnerable to that perpetrator that's either going to abuse and neglect or exploit them.
What I see, the number one key factor in our cases is not necessarily any type of memory loss. It's not Alzheimer's, it's not dementia. It's the isolation that our victims live in. Most of our victims have been widowed, and they like that communication. They like to have someone to talk to. And so through that, most of our offenders are very sweet to begin with. They get in through niceness. They don't come with a criminal badge written across their chest. And so they have a very easy time working their way into the life of our victim. And usually it's that conversation that our victims are looking for. And then what that generally evolves into is fear, because the perpetrator gets in first with kindness and then starts to use intimidation and threats and isolation to gain access to them. And then they feel that they have really no choice other than to give them what they want.
And sometimes when there's no family present, they need someone to talk to because they're home by themselves. So that perpetrator uses that to their advantage, and they build rapport.
Definitely seems that there's a psychology behind this, correct?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Is it typical when this abuse is taking place or this exploitation that there are other types of abuse as well? Is it multifaceted?
A lot of times it is. It's not just simply neglect, but a lot of times we'll see where there's a caregiver and there's neglect, indicators of neglect, but there's also where that caregiver's been going into that stock account or that checking account and taking funds.
I actually use the neglect section to charge many times that initially come to me from law enforcement as exploitation cases, but really what it turns out to be is that the caregiver or the person responsible for paying bills or taking care of the person is failing to do that, is not paying the assisted living facility. And so sometimes I have actually charged neglect charges when people wouldn't have thought to do that because they are failing to provide them with the care that they need. So I think those two go hand in hand quite a bit. And then we sometimes see the physical abuse happen when the perpetrator is trying to get money and may not be successful at getting money, and then a battery, a physical confrontation will occur. So I do see them go many times somewhat hand in hand.
And of course, that's the emotional part when they let the senior themselves know that they're worthless, they have no one, and with that saying, I'm the only one in here in your life. So at that point, they feel like they don't have anyone but this person, so they feel that they need to accept what's happening to them.
And that leads us to another point, that there could be other circumstances, family situations. How much does that complicate what situation you might be dealing with?
Family dynamics are unique. Each situation is different. However, based on what's going on in the family, there are instances where there may have been a history of neglect in the family. And now that we have the senior who's older, some of the adult children feel like it's time for get back, and they allow their families their family members to go through certain emotional and physical abuse.
I see quite a bit of punishment in cases where there may have been a history of domestic violence when the perpetrator was a child. Many times I do see some retribution at a later age that plays into a neglect where, we're just going to leave you there and let you fend for yourself because of what you did to me as a child. So we do see that.
Okay. Ron, Lauren, Pedro, thank you for getting this conversation started, and it is now time for a short break. And when we return, we'll focus on how cases of elder abuse are reported and investigated. We'll be right back. Welcome back to this Vital Living Forum on elder abuse. In our first segment, we talked about what elder abuse is and some of the reasons why it occurs. In this second segment, we'll focus on the legal aspects of elder abuse and the process for reporting elder abuse in Florida. Returning for this segment are Ron Bledsoe and Laura Moody. And also joining us is Carolyn Sawyer. Carolyn is the senior partner in the firm of Sawyer & Sawyer, PA, and practices in the areas of estate planning, probate trust administration, guardianship, Medicaid planning, VA planning, and special needs trusts. She is a member of the Florida Bar, the Orange County Bar Association, the National Academy of Elder Law Attorneys, and the Florida Association of Elder Law Attorneys, where she serves on the Committee for Elder Law Certification, is chairperson of the Committee on Elder Abuse, Neglect, and Exploitation, and is on the Board of Trustees. Welcome, all three of you, and back from the last segment. Thank you so much for joining us. Carolyn, we talked a little bit in the first segment about Florida Statute 825. Let's talk about Florida Statute 415. How do these two differ?
Chapter 415 is the framework focusing on identifying and protecting seniors from abuse. The system is centered around an intake through a central abuse hotline to report instances of abuse, neglect, or exploitation. Now, reports can be made confidentially by telephone, by fax, or by the internet. So there are plenty of ways to make the report. It is confidential, but details of the what's going on in the situation are all important to give the person who's in the other end of the line an ability to assess the situation, the importance, and the need for intervention. And there's a series of questions that will be asked, or in the case of the web, a series of questions to provide that information to the person who's taking the call.
Now, before we get into the specifics of elder abuse law, Ron, let's talk about how do elder abuse laws differ from child abuse laws?
The biggest difference between the adults and the children is capacity to consent. And with the adults, we actually assess the individuals for their capacity or their ability to make their own decisions regarding their care and protection. Where on the children's side, anyone 18 years, younger than 18 years of age, they automatically assess those persons as lacking capacity or not having the ability to make their own decisions.
How is capacity actually measured?
In the case of Chapter 415, the assessment begins when the investigator arrives, and the investigation procedures are all laid out in Chapter 14. This is a very difficult assessment to make. especially when there's a pressured situation. But in the training of the investigators, there are something like nine areas of questioning that the investigator goes through to assess the person's ability to understand or appreciate their own situation, their limitations, and what the consequences of their situation might be if nothing's done.
How does legal capacity actually differ from informed consent? Laura?
The real key thing when talking about DCF's involvement, and this is so important that people understand that DCF, Adult Protective Services, truly aren't going to impose their will on adults. And frequently I get individuals who are concerned about the fact that if they call out for help, that DCF is going to take their rights away. And I think that's very important for the public to know that unless a person actually lacks capacity, DCF is never going to impose their will. They actually may not choose to take a case if a person can consent to the use of their money or who lives in their home. And we frequently say, you know, people are entitled to make bad decisions, and the law is not going to get involved unless we can actually show that the person does not understand the consequences of their actions, does not understand how to manage their finances any longer. So I think that's the real key thing for individuals to know, is that if a person truly is authorizing millions of dollars being spent on things that you or I may not agree with, if they know what they're doing and they understand the consequences of that, the Department of Children and Families is not going to impose their will upon those individuals. But where we see somebody who can't make those decisions for themselves, that's where we become concerned.
When we go into a home and we do a capacity assessment, and if we see the person's at risk and they have capacity, we have to get them to agree to services or placement into a assisted living or skilled nursing facility. If we feel that they are at risk and that there is, say, for instance, self-neglect or neglect in the home, if they say, no, I don't want to go to a facility, I want to stay home, we can't, under the law, we can't force them to do something that's against their will, and we're not going to.
All right, let's go ahead and talk about something you mentioned briefly a few minutes ago, and that was the hotline. What is the Elder Abuse Hotline? Carolyn?
The Central Abuse Hotline, we'll call it the Central Abuse Hotline because it's not only for elderly people. This is a telephone number, 1-800, we probably will flash it on the screen, that a person can call to report what they believe is some kind of abuse, neglect, or exploitation of an elderly or actually a vulnerable adult. Mm-hmm. And when we're talking about persons at risk here, we're not only talking about elderly people, but we're talking about people who are vulnerable because of some sort of impairment, mental or physical. So this could be a 35-year-old that is experiencing, in a case that I saw, of exploitation, a situation where a gentleman was very, very disabled and eventually bedridden. Mentally he was fine, but because he wasn't able to get out of the bed or monitor what was going on in the home, his caregiver took away his phone, took away his computer, and she began really exploiting, using his money to buy cars, borrow money, etc. So in that case, he couldn't even call to make a report for himself. But someone who sees this going on can call and make a report, and it is confidential.
It's anonymous?
It's confidential in the sense that no one is given that information outside the system. But the focus of Adult Protective Services and the investigation is really services, providing services, not to catch or punish the perpetrator of the exploitation.
Walk me through what happens once that call comes in to the hotline.
When the hotline receives the call and they determine that there is a reason to accept the call that meets criteria of either abuse, neglect, exploitation, or self-neglect, then they're going to relay all the information that they've received from the caller to the local unit, whichever county it may be. It goes through our computer system down to the local level. We receive the report, and the supervisor for the particular unit assigns it to one of their investigators. The reports come in two ways. They'll either come in a 24-hour response, or those where the caller believes the person may be in danger, we have what we call an immediate response, which means we have to be out there within 3 hours of the time that we actually received the call.
And how do you know which one that would be? How do you find that out? If it should be a 24 response or a 3-hour
Well,
response?
it's based on whether there's danger to the victim in the case.
Okay.
And if the hotline feels that there is, then they're going to make an immediate report. And what they will probably also do is they will either call the local law enforcement to get them involved or advise the caller to call law enforcement immediately.
And one thing I wanted to add too that I think is so important that people know that Carolyn mentioned is that the reporter is never notified to the state attorney's office or law enforcement. We are not even entitled to that information. So people who may have some concerns about calling that hotline should really know that even law enforcement is not going to have their name and know who actually made that call. And it's very important so that people feel confident in calling. And DCF shares those reports with our office, and I always think it's very important that people know that we don't even have access to that information, so they are protected.
Definitely a good point to make. Now, when somebody calls that hotline, what kind of questions are they asked?
Well, they're going to be asking for once the person's name, their address, all their demographic information. Then they're going to also ask them what is actually occurring to try to get a synopsis of what's occurring to this person, and whether it be neglect, abuse, exploitation, or even self-neglect. They're going to try to determine whether there is reason to believe that it's occurring, and they're also going to be asking questions to determine whether it meets criteria under state law. Does it meet the definition of abuse or neglect or exploitation? And they're going to be asking the caller all that information to develop the report that eventually goes out to the local units.
That's a lot of questions, isn't it?
It's very important too to have as many details as possible, because the hotline will reject calls that they don't feel meet that criteria, and it may not be that the abuse isn't happening, but that the caller didn't know to give as many details as they possibly can. So they may call in and say somebody lost $20,000, and that may not be enough information, but if they add in that the person has dementia, that they haven't seen them in 3 weeks, some of those real key factors. So very important to have as many details as possible for the hotline.
And when the investigator arrives and assesses the capacity of the person to consent to the investigation or the provision of services, if that person says no, then there has to be a court order for the investigator to continue unless there's a threat of physical injury or death, and law enforcement can come in an emergency. But there will have to be follow-up through the court if there is doubt about capacity and being able to give consent and refusing to give consent.
What information should people be tracking so that when they do call into the hotline, they're better prepared to provide as much information as possible?
Probably the thing that we're looking for is there a pattern? Has there been any prior incidents at that residence or facility, whether it be a facility type report? And that's one of the main things they're going to be looking for. And they're going to try to get as much background as possible.
I think some of the red flags that they look for too would be, not having seen an individual for several weeks when they're used to seeing them come out of their house on a daily basis. If they went to church with them, they're no longer attending church, no longer participating in social organizations, don't answer the door, or what we frequently see is if it's a neighbor or somebody who does visit, that when they get there, they just sense that there's some type of intimidation happening where the person used to be very talkative and they don't want to talk anymore. They look very scared. Or one thing that we see frequently is a perpetrator who will not leave the victim's side. They want to be present for every conversation. They want to have control over the conversation. They speak for the person. So those types of things are very big red flags for us.
And we won't interview the victim in front of the perpetrator or the alleged perpetrator. That's confidential. We're not going to tell them what the victim told us. We're going to pull those persons aside and talk to them after we talk to the victim.
Are all calls investigated? And does the caller know that the call will be investigated, or if it moves forward?
Not all calls to the hotline are taken as a report. If it doesn't meet criteria or doesn't meet the reason to believe that it's possibly occurring, the hotline won't accept it as a report. A majority of the time, the hotline is going to inform the person to call the local office, and they're going to be told that they're not taking a report. But they will have the individual call the local office and talk to the supervisor or myself, for instance, to see what's going in the home. I may be able to get more information. We may have had contact with this person before, and I may be able to come up with enough information to actually feel that there is something going on, and I will call it back into the hotline.
And we've had, just from our office's perspective, we've had several cases come to us that DCF would not take the initial call, and that person was very persistent and felt like something was definitely going wrong, something very criminal was happening. So I would encourage people that if they do not get, if DCF does not take the case, that doesn't mean there's not a case. It may be that they need to call local law enforcement and get law enforcement involved. I get many calls straight to our office to get us involved. So many times, while that's the first place we want people to report to, sometimes cases come in a little bit reverse, and we have several cases that we've charged that DCF didn't take a call. One important thing is that they will frequently reject cases that involve business relationships. For a perfect example, in Brevard County, we get a lot of landscapers who like to charge $10,000 to cut one branch down. That's not the kind of case that DCF typically gets involved with, because they're more concerned about caregivers, caretakers, people in positions of trust. So really important to know that it doesn't have to stop just with that call to the hotline. If the person believes something significantly wrong has happened, be persistent with law enforcement and our office to try to get some action.
And they can also, when they call the hotline, if they're informed that they're not taking a report, they can ask to speak to a supervisor at the abuse hotline. And they can talk to a supervisor, and the supervisor can go over the particulars himself or herself and determine whether in fact there is or isn't a report there.
We have calls in our elder law practice from individuals who feel that there is abuse and exploitation going on, cases that the hotline has turned down because the perpetrator waives a power of attorney or a trust document in front of the investigator, convinces the investigator that they are authorized to do whatever is being done. In fact, that may not be the case at all, particularly since the 2011 upgrade or change of the Durable Power of Attorney Act.
And what did that do?
What that did was put in a great more specificity about what actions are authorized. Some have to be specifically initialed. And so it's a much more comprehensive document, but what I like the best is that there's much more accountability for both the agent and for third parties. The agent must always act in the best interest of the principal, the person who gave them that power. And if they're not, they are subject to being taken to court, having to pay attorney's fees, being removed, damages, also criminal liability.
I'd like to tell people that the power of attorney document gives people the ability to transact on a person's behalf. It does not give them the power to take advantage. And that's what we see a lot of abuse with that power of attorney document. We see a lot of law enforcement officers that believe it's a civil matter or that they have the authority to act, and it's truly not the case. In Chapter 825, one of the key provisions under 825 is that a breach of that fiduciary duty that a person owes when they are the agent is criminal exploitation. So it is, in fact, a crime.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us for this second segment. It is now time for a commercial break, and Laura and Carolyn will be back for our next segment. Ron, we want to thank you for being on the show. Please tell everyone how they can reach you.
My office number, the main line, is 407-317-7502. You can also contact me through the internet at Ron_Bledsoe, BLEDSOE, at dcf.state.fl.us.
All right, Ron, thank you very much, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the third and final segment of this Vital Living Forum on elder abuse. I'd like to welcome back Pedro Portuondo, Laura Moody and Carolyn Sawyer. During the first two segments, we've discussed what elder abuse is and how it is investigated. And in this final segment, we'll explore what families and communities can do to prevent elder abuse from occurring. So let's go ahead and get started about talking about warning signs. So Carolyn, what are some of the warning signs that people need to keep an eye out for that this could be happening?
When an elderly person stops communicating or appears not to be carrying on their normal life, if there's any change, they stop going to the doctor, they stop calling their daughter, that is a tip-off something's wrong. But of course, there are other signs. Financial exploitation, for example. In a case that I had, a 92-year-old lady called me and said her checks were bouncing at the bank. Now, what had happened was that while she was in the hospital because of a heart attack, her stepson took her husband to a lawyer, drafted an irrevocable trust. The stepson was the trustee, transferred the money out of their accounts into a trust account that he controlled, and their accounts were now empty. They had no money except their Social Security. And he wouldn't release any money to pay for the care of his own father. Now, this lady, my 92-year-old, called Adult Protective Services, but when they came out, the investigator was confronted with the stepson with the trust, saying, "I'm in charge." And she called me crying as an elder law attorney to see if I could help her on the civil side. Mm-hmm. Yes, we did.
What other warning signs are there? The financial, others, what others do you see?
One thing that I see frequently is a change of doctors. If a person has been attending a primary care physician for 50 years and then suddenly somebody comes in with power of attorney or acting as a trustee and suddenly changes their doctors, that makes us very suspicious. Also, bankers stand in a phenomenal position to watch the behavior of their clients. They know that their clients may only withdraw money by cash at the counter, and then suddenly when a teller starts to see numerous ATM transactions happening or checks being written, and that's not how they typically transact, those are huge red flags that we see frequently too.
I would imagine, though, that sometimes these warning signs are overlooked. Is that the case, Pedro, sometimes?
Sometimes they can be overlooked, especially if they're in a community. If they're in a community, that means that the individuals, their neighbors, their families are the only contacts that they have. So due to their isolation, individuals don't necessarily, people don't know that anything is going on with them. So if they're not communicating, it's very important that, you know, seniors have a support base with individuals so they can continuously communicate.
So staying alert, staying involved, what are some of the questions that family members should be asking their elder loved ones to make sure that this isn't happening?
Well, it's important for the children, for the family, to have an idea of what the parents, the elderly person's situation is. And if they have no idea of what assets they have, particularly if they're out of state and they're not monitoring at all what's happening with the parents' finances, they need to have a frank conversation so that they can be informed enough to know what's happening and maybe even authorized to monitor and watch over it. And having authorization ahead of time so they can do that in a reliable way is a way of making sure that the parent isn't exploited.
I think it's very important too for our seniors who maybe don't have family local, don't have necessarily close friends in the area, that they be diligent in watching their bank statements. So many times I get cases where the person has not monitored their finances. We may be dealing with somebody who is a widow and her husband may have dealt with the finances through their whole marriage. And so they turn that duty over to somebody who may not be that trustworthy. So I always encourage people to be very diligent, read the bank statements. Another huge red flag, if you were originally getting mailed statements in the mail from your bank and suddenly you're not after somebody has taken over doing your finances, they've converted it to online banking, check and sit down with that person on a monthly basis or a weekly basis to look at those bank account statements. Most of our financial cases come into us months after the transactions have happened, and that's a problem for collecting evidence, video surveillance that may be gone by the time we know about it. So people who may be on their own, it's really important to don't be lazy about finances, to definitely look at the bank statements, demand to see them, demand to know why they've been converted to online, and if they have gone to online banking, to sit down at the computer and don't just let that be an excuse. Definitely look at the finances.
And what's so important is to catch it early. Unfortunately, so often when someone calls an attorney and explains what's happened, it's too late. The money's gone. In this particular case of exploitation on my part, they had $400,000 that was locked up, and they couldn't access not only their Social Security. And the problem was, meanwhile, that exploiter could be spending and misusing that money till it's gone.
When I speak to seniors in the community, I tell them it's very important for them to pick a responsible person in their family to assist them. There are times that individuals just need a little assistance, but it's important that they maintain the independence that they need. So if they continue to go to the bank, because it's important that the bank tellers, and they have that relationship with the banks, so they see the individuals. So that way, if a different person comes that catches a check, if you have a relationship with that bank person, the teller may be able to flag that, and that can help stop or catch the exploitation before it gets out of hand.
And I would say, don't always assume too that the most trustworthy person is your family member. There may be times that you want to hire a financial advisor or an attorney or somebody who's not necessarily close enough to steal or do some of the damage. So sometimes the most trustworthy person may not actually be the closest person to you, and that's very important to remember.
One of the best tools against exploitation, if the person is actually losing capacity, is guardianship. So that if the elderly person's memory is getting such they can't remember they're not looking at their bank statements, they don't know where they stand or what's happening with their money, guardianship is the answer. An attorney is hired, files a petition to determine that that person has lost capacity or is incapacitated. And at that point, there is, in a different way, there's an investigation and a determination of capacity by the courts. And actually not only removing control from that person who no longer is able to manage it, but delegating the management authority to a guardian who then must report to the court what they're doing with that person's money.
Right.
And be accountable.
Yes, yes, accountable. Here's the initial inventory, here's an annual accounting, account by account, expense by expenditure, one by one. It's audited by the courts. An observation is sent out. If anything is out of order, there's a show cause hearing to come back and explain things that don't make sense. A guardian can be removed, a guardian can be charged.
And people can voluntarily enter into guardianship. So a person doesn't have to lack capacity, so that can be a great tool to have somebody managing finances and also be accountable to a judge if they misuse that ability.
And when presenting to seniors, I let them know that we're not specifically saying that all caregivers. We're talking about those caregivers that are being irresponsible.
I know there's a fine line between getting the information and being intrusive. So how do you counsel family members to get the information they need and ask some of these really difficult questions? Is there anything they should avoid?
Well, there's things that are going on in society currently that would open up that conversation so that they can at least say, hey, Mom, what's going on? Is there some, if there's a change in pattern, and once you start the conversation, they'll see how the senior will be okay with sharing some of that information, because it's very important that seniors tend to understand that, because at times you can get a call and a person can call you by name, and with repetition becomes reality. They may be trying to sell you something. That may be that person outside that knocks on your door and says, I saw this leak coming from your roof. There's a lot of scams that are happening out there that seniors are really being preyed upon on. So it's important that the families really have that rapport with that person, not leaving them isolated.
Well, in a conversation, it's important not to put the parent on the defensive. I like the idea of developing a team approach. If there's another sibling, if there could be a family meeting that is it's about we, not you aren't doing this right, and in that way making it a collaborative kind of effort.
And it really assists in prosecution of these cases and investigations to not blame the individual, because truly it's the person who's doing the abuse, doing the stealing, who is at fault. It is never the victim's fault. And many times we get cases where the family is really mad at their parent. How could you have given all of your money away?
Our money.
My money. How could you have signed that document, Mom? And those are the cases where what we're going to see is the victim will then side with the perpetrator because they don't want to look like they've lost control. So they will then say, oh, well, I let them do that. And that is inherently a defense to our criminal cases. So it's very important not to accuse, not to blame, not to belittle the person, because they already have felt that embarrassment or shame from losing the money. Then when you couple it with, that they're
Blame.
the one at fault, that definitely not a great approach.
Right. And it was a situation with a sibling that was living out of town, and the mother was living with one of the daughters, and the daughter that was in town was isolating the mother from speaking to the other sibling. What the sibling was noticing, because apparently she had access to the mother's account online and could see things but wasn't able to move things, was seeing that there were a lot of transactions that didn't pertain to the mother's care. So she was at that point able to call the 1-800-96-ABUSE hotline to have that sibling investigated, and ultimately there were some changes made. But it's important, again, to have that communication with mom and dad.
Mm-hmm. What would you suggest to family members to combat elder abuse? What are some things that they can do in terms of awareness and steps that they can take, even to make the elders a little bit more aware of what could possibly happen?
Well, our agency, Senior Resource Alliance, we do educational professional training in the community. It's very important, and it's free. So they can just go on the website, Senior Resource Alliance, and they can find out when the next presentation is, and they can get a lot of information in the understanding of abuse, neglect, and exploitation.
I think the key thing is don't assume that everybody is going to act in your best interest. So for our seniors who are living at home and want to stay at home, if they can manage their finances still, I encourage that. We see a lot of people turn over their debit cards with PIN numbers to, non-trusted individuals that they may have known. Literally, I have cases, they've known them for one day, and it's difficult for them to get out to the grocery store. It's difficult for them to get to the gas station, so they just hand over their debit card, their PIN number, their checkbook. So to be very cautious with who you give that power to, putting somebody on a bank account as a joint account holder. We get frequent calls from DCF and from law enforcement where a joint account holder has stolen all of the funds. There is nothing that we can do if we can't show that somehow that is entirely the person's funds and that they were really put on that account solely as a convenience signer, that they really never contributed any of the money. So I always caution people that before you sign any document, before you put somebody on account, really know what legal rights you're giving up when you do that. Talk to a lawyer, talk to a civil lawyer before you make those changes, because you do give people a great ability to transact with your money when you do that.
And that's one time to contact an elder law attorney. Carolyn, when else should family members or friends contact an attorney for an elder they think is being abused?
Well, it's especially important if they think that that person who's been abused is not capable of fighting back or protecting themselves. Now we're talking about the possibility of guardianship. And there is such a thing as limited guardianship, where it can only be of some certain property rights or perhaps healthcare rights. So best choice is to have trustworthy people appointed to get information and manage information and monitor what's happening in the senior's life. The fallback in the civil world is guardianship, or in some cases civil lawsuits, but they take so long and they cost so much money.
And I want to make sure we get this in there. Local and national organizations that you want to make sure that people are aware of. What are some of them?
The local will be the 1-800-96-ABUSE hotline, which is here. Toll-free number. Beautiful part is a live person on the other line. They're going to take the information, who the client is, where they live, what type of abuse is taking place. Within 24 hours, an APS investigator will come out to the scene. They'll investigate exactly what was said. At that point, then they can determine whether it's founded, unfounded, and move on from there. It's totally anonymous. The person doesn't have to leave their name or their information, but at that point, we looked at the safety of the clients, and that's kind of very important.
Pedro, tell folks how they can reach you.
I'm at Senior Resource Alliance, 407-514-1800.
All right. Well, Pedro, thank you so much for joining us. We do appreciate it.
It's my
Laura,
pleasure.
how can viewers reach you?
At the Office of the State Attorney in Brevard County, our number is 321-617-7510. You can reach me by email at lmoody@sa18.org, and if I can find a resource, I will refer people out.
Very good. Carolyn, how can we reach you?
Well, I'm at Sawyer and Sawyer. Our telephone number is 407-909-1900, and we have a website, www.sawyerandsawyerpa.com.
All right. Well, Carolyn Sawyer, Laura Moody, Pedro Potrondo, thank you so much for joining us and discussing this very, very important topic. Thank you.
Thank you.
And the mistreatment of elders is a real problem that families and communities are struggling to address. While authorities simply do not know for sure how many people are suffering from elder abuse, they do know it is severely underreported and on the rise. This is concerning, especially considering the United States is in the middle of major demographic shifts. By the year 2050, there will be more elderly people on Earth than children for the first time in history because of rising lifespans and falling birth rates. As we close the show, I ask each of you to learn more about elder abuse, how to spot it, report it, and prevent it. Thank you. The Vital Living Forum is part of Orange County's Vital Living block on Vision TV. And for more information, please visit us on the web at www.orangetvfl.net or contact the Orange County Office on Aging at 407-836-6563. I'm Katie Dagenet. Thank you for joining us.